Happy Halloween from Scotland. This is our fourth lecture on our week's focus will be psychic phenomena, psychological disturbance, dreams, and the uncanny again. We're going back to Freud for a little more depth this week. We will be reading stories by Henry James, the master of the ghost story, of the short story, of the novella, and the novel at the turn of the century. Annie Proulx, who is a contemporary, a New England contemporary, but sets her short stories often in Wyoming. And Joyce Carol Oates, also writing now, and D.H. Lawrence with a classic story called The Rocking Horse Winner. I'm going to start today with Elaine Scarry's Dreaming by the Book. This is going to appear in your written craft lesson as well. She writes about what she calls the physiology of the imagination, how the ghost story actually reflects how we think, the processes of our vision and our brains. It's a sort of neuroscientific or cognitive view of creating this kind of literature. Why, when the lights go out and the storytelling begins, is the most compelling tale, most convincing, most believable, a ghost story? Since most of us have no experience of ghosts in the material world, this should be the tale we least easily believe. The answer is that the story instructs its hearers to create an image whose own properties are second nature to the imagination. It instructs its hearers to depict in mind something thin, dry, filmy, two-dimensional, and without solidity. That's where we are opening this week as we transfer from the solid world to the spiritual, sort of losing the body, I think would be the theme. And that is where in Elaine Scarry's readings, she is a critic, literary critic who is based at Harvard. She is referring to how the imagination ignites along filmy, ethereal lines. She also has this phrase which is related to the gauze of the imagination, the gossamer of the imagination. The eyes, meanwhile, are also in motion, rolling from left to right and back again, skating down the page, darting back to a detail missed and forward again. She's describing the act of reading there. Their actual motion is incorporated into the motion of fictional persons, so that our somatic mimesis of what is happening in the book works to substantiate and vivify motions on the mental retina that are wholly imaginary. So in this, she is saying that the way that our vision in reading, the left to right sort of action, the direction of the way that we read on the page, actually then has some bearing on how we perceive characters as well. And there's a mimesis or copying of how characters move through a story, which is very strange. But our eyes basically dart around with the motion of characters. On to Freud, that we have a large subsection on the uncanny this week and what that means. These are some of the highlights of his work on the uncanny. Our conclusion could then be stated as follows: the uncanny element, we know from experience, arises either when repressed childhood complexes are revived by some impression, or when primitive beliefs that have been surmounted appear to be once again confirmed. There's different pieces to this statement, that you can only have uncanniness if there's been repression, often that repression is happening at an early age. What happens when we encounter something uncanny is these beliefs that are deep-seated, but also they're very primitive. They are unschooled beliefs. They are superstitious beliefs. With education, we have overcome them, but the uncanny sort of just wipes that away and returns us to those initial fears as if those are true, and what we have learned is a sort of papering over of a sort of fundamentals about how the universe works and how it is quite malign and out to get us. In the presence of the uncanny, a person feels helpless, as if they're caught in a dream that's moving, that they are being propelled through. There is this element of compulsive repetition. Look out for that in the ghost story. He writes, in another set of experiences, we have no difficulty in recognizing that it's only the factor of unintended repetition that transforms what otherwise would seem quite harmless into something uncanny and forces us to entertain the idea of the fateful and the inescapable when we should normally speak of chance. So, and this is the idea that we're on a sort of track that, and that track is repeating, and we can't free ourselves from it. In the unconscious mind, we can recognize the dominance of a compulsion to repeat, which proceeds from instinctual impulses. The compulsion probably depends on the essential nature of the drives themselves. It is strong enough to override the pleasure principle and lend a demonic character to certain aspects of mental life. It is still clearly manifest in the impulses of small children and dominates part of the course taken by the psychoanalysis of victims of neurosis. Anything can remind us of this inner compulsion to repeat is perceived as uncanny. So again, it's this return to childhood instincts, childhood habits, things that we should have outgrown. The analysis of cases of the uncanny has led us back to the old animistic view of the universe. Animism is things moving out their own volition. A view characterized by the idea that the world was peopled with human spirits, by the narcissistic overrating of one's own mental processes, by the omnipotence of thoughts and techniques of magic that relied on it, by the attribution of carefully graded magical powers, these were called mana, to alien persons and things, and by all the inventions with which the unbounded narcissism of that period of development sought to defend itself against the unmistakable sanctions of reality. That is that the world around us is moving of its own accord, that people have no agency over things, that things will sort of take their revenge. If psychoanalytic theory is right in asserting that every affect arising from an emotional impulse of whatever kind is converted into fear by being repressed, it follows that among those things that are felt to be frightening, there must be one group in which it can be shown that the frightening element is something that's been repressed and now returns. This species of frightening would then constitute the uncanny, and it would be immaterial whether it was itself originally frightening or rose from another effect. Therefore, we have a fear, we push that fear down, that fear comes back and reasserts itself when we least expect it. The link with repression now illuminates the definition of the uncanny as something that should have remained hidden and has now come out into the open. You're going to read an anecdote which is from Strand magazine, which Freud found particularly illustrative of his point on animism, and it's about a couple that purchase a crocodile table shaped like a crocodile, and as they are walking around in the night, they start hearing scuttling on the stairs and think they're bumping into something that's kind of scaly. And it's very creepy. That is a perfect example of that uncanniness at work. The imagination sort of getting obsessed with this very irrational idea. We are told that it is highly uncanny when inanimate objects, pictures or dolls, come to life. But for instance, in Hans Christian Andersen's stories, the household utensils, the furniture, and the tin soldier are alive, and perhaps nothing is farther removed from the uncanny. Even when Pygmalion's beautiful statue comes to life, this is hardly felt to be uncanny. So this is a distinction made between how the fairy tale works and how a ghost story works, and these situations that are not felt to be in this this realm of the eerie and the spooky and the weird and the unhomely, the unheimlich, but sort of all above board in the daylight, and we're not worried about the fairy tales. Why is that? The false semblance of death and the raising of the dead has been represented to us as very uncanny themes, but again, such things are commonplace in fairy tales. Who would go so far as to call it uncanny when, for instance, Snow White opens her eyes again, and the raising of the dead and miracle stories, those of the New Testament, for example, arouses feelings that have nothing to do with the uncanny. The unintended recurrence of the same thing has produced effects that are undoubtedly uncanny, yet in a number of cases it serves other quite different ends. We've already mentioned that one of these can produce a comic effect, and that such instances could be multiplied. At other times, it's used for emphasis and so on. Moreover, where does the uncanny effect of silence, solitude, and darkness come from? Do not these factors point to the part played by danger in the genesis of the uncanny, even though these are the conditions under which children are most often seen to express fear? And we can completely discount the element of intellectual uncertainty, given that we've admitted to its importance in relation to the link between the uncanny and death. So there's this other piece to the uncanny, and that's that there has to be a threat on life. There's a danger, and death is lurking. The uncanny derives from what was once familiar and then repressed. And then how the uncanny works in literature, which is different than how we might recall uncanny moments in our lives, things that sort of catch us as a strange coincidence. But there's a particular sort of working in of the thematic uncanny. The uncanny we find in fiction and creative writing, imaginative literature, actually deserves to be considered separately. It's above all much richer than what we know from experience. It embraces the whole of this and something else besides, something that is wanting in real life. The distinction between what is repressed and what is surmounted cannot be transferred to the uncanny in literature without substantial modification, because the realm of the imagination depends for its validity on its contents being exempt from the reality test. The apparent paradoxical upshot of this is that many things that would be uncanny if they occurred in real life are not uncanny in literature. There are many opportunities to achieve uncanny effects that are absent in real life. So it works both ways. To produce an uncanny effect, for as we've seen, a sense of the uncanny can arise only if there's a conflict of judgment as to whether what has been surmounted and merits no further credence may not, after all, be possible in real life. The imaginative writer may have invented a world that which, while less fantastic than that of the fairy tale, differs from the real world in that it involves supernatural entities such as demons or spirits of the dead. We adapt our judgment to the conditions of the writer's fictional reality and treat souls, spirits, and ghosts as if they were fully entitled to exist, just as we are in our material reality. Here, too, there is no place for the uncanny. Not so, however, if the writer has to all appearances taken up his stance on the ground of common reality. By doing so, he adopts all the conditions that apply to the emergence of a sense of the uncanny in normal experience. Whatever has an uncanny effect in real life has the same in literature. But the writer can intensify and multiply this effect far beyond what is feasible in normal experience. In his stories, he can make things happen that one would never or only rarely experience in real life. In a sense, then he betrays us to the superstition we thought we had surmounted. He tricks us by promising us everyday reality and then going beyond it. We react to his fictions as if they'd been our own experiences. So in this is this key to a semblance, this very close semblance, this intense realism, so that we believe the story, we don't question it, and yet this kind of subtle working in of repetitions that just keep harping on the same string, different imagery, as we saw last week in The Girl I Left Behind Me, that use of lyric song coming back in a story you will read this week from Annie Proulx, which is called The Sagebrush Kid. There's this incredible carnivorous plant that has takes on a life of its own, and this sagebrush kid, as it's called, is being fed in all sorts of ways, and the vegetation will keep reasserting itself. I'm going to ask you in the exercises or in some of the questions from the reading to sort of think up one of your own monsters, which fits with our time of year, as everyone climbs into costumes and transforms tomorrow night. I'm going to ask you if you've ever encountered a monster in the dark, this sort of crocodiles that we mistake for table legs, or the other way around. And an example that I can give from my own household is a sisal plant that used to be in the backyard, which just kept expanding in these long spiky leaves that would pierce one of us as we were heading out to walk the dog, or I think there was absolutely no burglar that could get past that plant. It just grew and grew to sort of phenomenal proportions after starting out as just your average sisal. So I'm thinking of that plant as a kind of transmogrified household object, and I'm asking you to consider what might be your own. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the reading this week. And I look forward to your next set of workshop stories. Good night.